Hi, this is Tyler, and this video is about explaining what the mysterious dollar signs in Microsoft Excel cell references do. So cell reference is, you got see I've got some sample data here. I've just got some numbers that I want to sum up in this formula, so that I've already created. In this formula, it's summing cells C8 to C12. So the cell reference is this range C8 to C12. Sometimes you also see summing done like this, where people are just going C8 plus C9 plus C10 plus C11 plus C12. But that's the long way of doing it. A lot more work than simply doing sum. Now, dollar signs, which you may have seen in various formulas, either that you've created or maybe you've seen in spreadsheets that other people have created, dollar signs would be if these things look like that. This is something you can manually do just by hitting F4 or Command T in OS X, F4 in Windows. And if you keep hitting that command, or toggling F4 or Command T, you can see that it'll cycle through dollar signs on the row and the column, on just the row or just the column, or back to no dollar signs. Okay, well, what the heck are dollar signs? So first of all, dollar sign is telling Excel that you want this to be an absolute reference. An absolute reference means as you manipulate the formula and maybe drag it around or copy it to other parts of the worksheet, it's not going to move that data. So if you were referring to C8 before, maybe I'll show an example of this. So if I just say, hey, C8, that's all this cell does, is I'm repeating the data in C8. And if I were to drag this around, you'll see that these numbers change. That's because it wasn't absolute, it was relative. As I drag things down, it became C9 and then C10. Likewise, if I were to drag the other direction, it's going to go C8, D8, E8. So by nature, or by default, Excel considers things relative because it knows that a lot of times you want this to be the case. And I'll show an example right here. I'm going to delete that. So I had this info A and info B, and I've already summed up column A. So very common, probably what I'm going to want to do is also sum up column B. Excel makes this easy because you can just drag this formula, grab this little handle down here, drag it over, and ta-da, that actually looks right. Let's double check it looks right. I'm going to click up here. Ah, yes, it is now summing D8 to D12. And I come back here with C8 to C12. So this is the power of relative references. As I dragged it over, it automatically assumed that because I went over a column, I probably want to update my underlying data column. Now, what if I had gone in here and said, no, I want it to be fully absolute? Well, now if I drag this over, I'm just going to over drag just to demonstrate. You see that it's the same value in each case. In fact, it's using the same data. It hasn't moved from C. Likewise, if I got crazy and dragged down, you'll see that it hasn't done anything weird like that. It's kept the cells absolute. So in this case, you didn't want it absolute, but in many cases you would. And to kind of demonstrate maybe some of the benefits of both here, I'm going to show, since I'm a game designer, I like to give game design examples, so just roll with it. I've put some data in here ahead of time just so you don't have to watch me enter it all in. But actually, I'm going to hide that for a minute, and we will come back to it. Let's say, oops, there. Haha. So I hid and then unhid. Let's say we wanted to, we're doing a strategy game. We got tanks, super tanks. And let's say through playtesting, we determined that there's this master cost input. Because what we're trying to do is we want to know how much should a tank or super tank cost. And in this case, maybe through playing we found that units should basically cost their total stats times this master cost input. And so first of all, total stats. You can see here I've plugged in some random stats, actually super tanks and super tanks should always increase here. So let's just say things go up. Defense 10 and 15, and move, we'll say tanks move 2 and then 3 and then 4. So clearly the units get better as we go to the right. And if we want to calculate the total cost as the sum of the stats, first we got to sum the stats. So remember relative versus absolute. So right now I've got things in with no dollar signs, meaning it's relative. So if I want to sum the stats of these other two units, I don't need to add any $signs in because I can simply drag over and it's going to update correctly. That's what I wanted, just like in the example to the left. However, now I want to calculate cost. So like I said, just assume that we decided should be your total stat times this master cost input figure. So a tank is going to cost 178. Awesome. Drag over. Oops. We've clearly run into an error here. A super tank shouldn't cost 0. There's actually probably nothing should cost 0. So this is one of those cases where the errors are quite easy to see. Whereas over here, for example, you can see that, oh, this could be easily missed in your spreadsheet. You might not really go to the trouble to notice that these numbers are different and this sum should be different. So this error is harder to detect, the fact that it should have been this. Whereas here, 0. Okay, phew. Well, let's look at what's going on here. Well, if we click in the formula, we can see that Excel, in its infinite wisdom, because we told it was a relative reference, has tried to move this over, and there's no data there. But wait, it has moved over the total stats, and that's what we do want. So here's an example of where you want a mix of relative and absolute references. So the easy solution here is we come up, I'm going to hit F4 or Command T to make this a fully absolute reference. Note that I left J14 as is because I do want that to move. Now I'm going to drag this over. Aha, this looks more correct. So let's investigate to make sure. Yes, and yes. Okay, so now through the power of the $sign, we've saved ourselves a little trouble. So a lot of people, maybe if they don't understand $signs, they might do stuff like this. Well, that is that times, oops, that, and this is that times that. Great, we got in the same result. But now imagine if you had 100 units or 1,000 or you know, very common, you can be dealing with large amounts of data. Maybe you've got items in an RPG game or something like that, and you literally have hundreds and hundreds of items. You want to make this formula once and drag it over. You don't want to be entering it a million times. So there you go. Now, you can also do, you notice that if you hit F4 or Command T, you can toggle through how many $signs there are. Now that you know about $signs, it should make sense that if you had a $sign on just the column, that means it won't increment the column, or just the row, it won't increment the row. Now, where are situations that you might want to do that? Well, I've constructed one here that hopefully will make sense. We'll find out. Okay, so let's instead say that instead of plugging in all these values, we want to actually construct our units based on a smaller number of inputs. Now this is a good systems design approach, whether you're dealing games or anything else. Sometimes rather than have n squared number of kind of inputs here, it might make sense to have less, but whatever. We'll just go with this example. Strength factor. Let's say instead of inputting the stats directly, I just know that I want tanks to have strength factor 1, super tanks to be 2, and super tanks to be 3. Then elsewhere I've found that a base unit of hit points to deal with is 10, base unit of attack is 5. You know, these are kind of just other considerations that you may have determined based on the rest of the game. Now I want to calculate the stats for a tank. So I want a tank to be base stats times the strength factor. Okay, cool. So a tank has hit points of 10. Now I want this to be true as I drag, basically as I calculate rest. I could go in here manually and say, oh, well, now a tank has a base attack times strength factor and so on. But now that we know the power of cell references, this would be pretty silly to do. And by the way, as a quick aside, I tend to put shade all my cells in blue that are user inputs. So this is how I can keep track of the fact that this is a calculated number versus this is something I want to be able to hand edit. And this will make maybe more sense at the end. So in this case, I've got great base hit points times strength factor. Now, how am I going to drag this? Well, I could try that. Oops, well, that didn't look so good. And I could try that. Well, that didn't look so good. Anytime you get a bunch of zeros and this error code from Excel, you know something is going wrong. Now, you should understand enough at this point to know what's going wrong. As I dragged over, Excel assumed the references were relative, So this was correct. I did want to go to the strength factor of SuperTank, but this was incorrect. Now I could come in here and use my handy F4. That would be cool, because make this all absolute. And now I'm going to drag that, and I'm going to drag that. Wait a second. That doesn't make sense, right? Because super tanks are supposed to be stronger. Well, note that I'm using the exact same data for the exact same calculation, even though I dragged it, because I went full absolute. So in this case, I clearly don't want full absolute. But what do I want? Okay, well, let's think. In this case, I would like to use this number. So what does that mean? So I can't go full relative, can't go full absolute. So H9, what if I just made H9? Clearly want that to be just the column part of it. And then up here, I would like, for reasons that will become clear in a minute, I could get away with doing just this for the moment, and it won't be obvious that I've made a mistake because I dragged this over. Excuse me. It will be obvious, but if I just had it like that and dragged over, there, ta-da. That's what we want. And over here you can see, why did this happen? Because we've got the dollar signs where we need them. We've got a dollar sign in front of the column here. So as we drag over it, it still used H. That's exactly what we want, but not in front of the column up here. And note that I have put a dollar sign in front of the K6. I think what I was trying to say a minute ago is I could get away with this for the moment, leaving the top full relative, and you wouldn't notice you have an error until you try to fill down. Now you've got the error. So this is a cool example of where what we really want is we want the row on this top input to be fixed. We want the column on the left input to be fixed. Now, long story made long, but done short now. We can drag over and down, and we are now calculating the stats entirely accurately based on these different inputs. And that's the power of cell references. So there you go. There's some examples of why you might want full absolute, full relative, or a mixture. I find use these all the time, and now that you know what they do, hopefully you will too. And this has been Tyler. Thanks for watching, and check out my other game design and Excel related videos.